Welcome to the Common Man Football Show. My name is James Coburn, and today's episode, we're talking about college football Week 11 top 25 metric picks. And as each week goes, we're going to do a recap of what happened last week with picks, talk a little bit about some of the games that were lost. This is probably not the worst week ever, but definitely not as good as prior weeks. Get into some reasons as to why that was, and of course get into the picks for this week based purely on the top 25 team matchups this week and for week 11. And of course, all terms and definitions will be in the description. So again, if you're not familiar with any of the work that I do, you can just go to the description and kind of get through all that stuff. So looking at this week, so basically recap of the week that was week 10. Now again, this was not the best week ever. A couple games that were missed with the data. A lot of games really. Went 11-7, which is still over 60%, which is good. But definitely a lot of games were not made up. First off, Michigan State versus Penn State. This is a game that I really don't think you could. I just can't see how you could have predicted this outcome. Going into that game, Michigan State was a 55.94 to a 99.37 for Penn State in terms of their overall data score, in terms of their overall team score. That's like a legit, oh my gosh, crazy upset. Like that's just there's not a lot to really predict that. Going into that game, Michigan State was not really playing that well on offense, first off. And secondly, the defense was good, but not necessarily based on paper was good enough to like shut down Penn State's offense. And I do think there's some lingering kind of stuff from that Ohio State loss that I think kind of carried over into this game for whatever reason. But ultimately, that was definitely a shocker for sure based on data. Then, of course, you get to the Stanford-Washington State game. Now, that was actually a fairly close game. Ultimately, Washington State won. Stanford was ranked pretty high overall over Washington State, but Washington State was just able to kind of pull it out. So ultimately, that's just how that game went. I mean, both these teams are fair. They're kind of not neck and neck, but they were neck and neck at one point, and then Stanford kind of pulled away a little bit towards this deep of the season. But ultimately, it definitely was a game that was kind of blindsided data-wise. Which of course gets to Iowa, Ohio State. That game in particular, a big driver of the game was turnovers. JT Barrett, for all the criticism that he gets, he doesn't really throw a ton of turnover. Like he's not a huge turnover machine. He's not out there throwing 3 picks, 4 picks, 5 picks, stuff like that. But this was one of those games where that happened. A lot of things that don't normally happened in this game. Going into this game, Iowa was about a 75.05 to 98.50 for Ohio State. And that definitely was a shocker game. And in many ways just kind of tells you a little bit about the depth of the Big Ten. I mean, the Big Ten is a really brutal, tough conference, guys. And again, the SEC is great and all. And again, I love the SEC people. I love SEC football as much as anybody. But the Big Ten consistently has just tons of these really good football teams all kind of clustered together in that conference. So, and this kind of was a week to kind of prove that cluster, kind of prove that, basically the strength of that overall conference, I think, is what a lot of these losses kind of indicate. Then, of course, you get to Iowa State versus West Virginia. And this was another game that, went to West Virginia instead of Iowa State. The big thing about West Virginia, they have a very good offense, but their defense is not that great. And for whatever reason, Iowa State was just not able to, basically they weren't able to get it done. They were able to get it done against other teams. They were able to kind of prove consistency throughout the year, but they just couldn't do it in this game for whatever reason. But definitely kind of a hard loss to swallow. Then, of course, we get to one of the close games this week. Oklahoma versus Oklahoma State. 85.23 to 88.37 for Oklahoma State was how the data had it. Very close game. Almost too close to call. the better quarterback ended up winning this game, and that was actually something I was going to look into data-wise. Is does having a really highly efficient quarterback, does that give you an advantage? More so than anything else. So I want to kind of look into that once the offseason gets here, because it's going to take a lot of additional data work. But that definitely is a loss. That's 3-point difference in that game in particular, but that definitely was a loss for the data. Then, of course, you get Miami versus Virginia Tech, and that was another very close game, 93.10 to 98.60 in that particular game. So, and that was just a close game. I mean, there's not much else to say. And yeah, it wasn't a close game in terms of outcome, but definitely just a close game data-wise in that particular game. 98.60 to 93.10. So, it is what it is. And then, of course, you get Arizona versus USC. Another very tight game, 68.53 for Arizona and then 67.86 for USC. USC has been an up-and-down football team this entire year. And, ultimately, what else can you say? So, not the best week. I've had better weeks. I've had undefeated weeks. I've had, higher in weeks. But definitely above 500, 60% in terms of win accuracy, which is still winning. #winning. But let's get into the picks for this week. So getting into the top 25 matchups for this week, we have Stanford versus Washington. This is an early week game, and I don't feel good about this game at all. Very close. The O/D point score, which is that's the big score to really pay attention to, is the O/DPts score. That's a 93.63 to 99.28 for Washington. Whew, close. So ultimately, again, the data goes for Washington, but that is a really close game. Then, of course, you get Michigan State versus Ohio State. Michigan State, of course, just took down Penn State. Ohio State coming off of a tough loss as well. Really don't want to go Michigan State here. Again, points-wise, Michigan State just doesn't put up points. Their defense did show up against Penn State, but ultimately, I don't know what else to say. I mean, if you want to just go with the crazy Michigan State victory, which was, again, data-wise, it was just kind of a fluke. Like, it came out of nowhere. They don't put up a ton of points. They don't have a really great completion percentage. If you want to bet on Ohio State having another down week like Penn State did, go ahead. But I wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily do that. And then, of course, you get Penn State versus Rutgers. Penn State all the way for the most part. I mean, it's Rutgers. I mean, another down week. I wouldn't necessarily go with that. And then, of course, Iowa State versus Oklahoma State. In this particular game, Iowa State is favored here, 94.55 to 73.99. Iowa State was also favored against a fairly similar game, in fact, with West Virginia, in which case West Virginia won. So definitely a game that I'm not questioning the data 100%, but I am questioning the validity of the defensive impact, like the impact that Iowa State's defense could have. If they get it, basically it's like this: Iowa State is going to win games if they play a team that has a offense that they can shut down, And I'm not quite sure. This just looks like Oklahoma State, is going to pull a West Virginia here, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And who knows? I mean, we'll see what the data does, but the data does have it more so for Iowa State in that particular matchup. Then, of course, we get Boston College versus North Carolina State. North Carolina State is favored here. Connecticut versus UCF. UCF pretty heavily favored here. UCF is probably one of the best, if not the best, non-Power 5 conference team in terms of all three phases of football. Then, of course, you get Arkansas versus LSU. LSU has it in this particular game. Arkansas is just not that great this year. They just have been bad. Haven't won a lot of games either. Then, of course, we get Georgia State versus Virginia Tech. This has it for Virginia Tech, over Georgia Tech. So not much else to really say about that game. Then, of course, we get to the next matchups. Iowa versus Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin is favored here, but it's important to remember that Iowa has played a really tough schedule. Wisconsin, not so much. So this is one of those games where even though the data does pretty heavily favor Wisconsin, Wisconsin played such a light schedule kind of an average schedule compared to Iowa, that this could go to Iowa's favor. Although Iowa just has issues in terms of putting up points. This entire year they've had that issue specifically. So this is kind of a prove-it game for Wisconsin, to be honest. Like, this is the first kind of legit team, that's proven, that's kind of proven itself a bit to kind of do this. And then, of course, we get to Clemson, Florida State. Clemson favored here pretty heavily. Florida State is just not that great this year in terms of all two phases of the game. Then, of course, you get Colorado versus USC, and USC is favored here 63.71 to 40.83. Utah versus Washington State. Washington State is favored here. Alabama versus Mississippi State. Alabama, but this is close game. 99.81 for Alabama, 94.11 for Mississippi State. I don't think Mississippi State is going to upset Alabama, but the possibility is there based on data. I think the overall data does favor Alabama. I mean, if you look at all three phases, if you look at offense, if you look at defense, if you look at special teams, although Mississippi State does have it in terms of special teams, but if you look at just the general offense, defensive data, Alabama has it across the board versus Mississippi State. So, but this is going to be a very interesting game to say the least. And of course, we get Oklahoma, TCU. In this particular matchup, it's TCU 99.57 to 75.10. The only real thing that Oklahoma has going for it is Baker Mayfield. The defense is not existent. TCU's defense is able to stop guys. Oklahoma does not have that. So ultimately, this is going to be a shootout, and we'll see who wins. The data does favor TCU, but again, it's Mayfield. It's basically a shootout, and if you believe Mayfield is legit, then the TCU defense will not be as impactful as the data would suggest, is basically what I'm trying to say. Then, of course, we get Miami versus Notre Dame. In this particular game, it's very close, 93.97 and 97.83, so 4-point difference between these two teams. Miami, in general, has a more balanced offense, I would say, but not amazing. The only sort of inefficiency with Notre Dame is their special teams and their completion percentage on offense. So those two phases are the only things that really kind of hurt Notre Dame. But for the most part, this is a very close game. So almost pretty much too close to call, to be honest, because of how close it is. And then lastly, we get to Arizona versus Oregon State. And in this matchup, it pretty much goes to Arizona. Oregon State is a really bad football team. They've not won a lot of football games, and I don't expect them to win this week. So ultimately, those are the top 25 picks for this week. Here's the cheat sheet for wins and losses this week. This is a very nuanced week. This is a week I don't think the data is going to go perfect this week, I should say, because there's a lot of games that are very close, a lot of dicey games here, and ultimately when it's dicey, you want to go away from those games. Again, last week, not the best week, but ultimately, if you've seen the past videos, there's a lot of consistency here in terms of getting above 500, and just leave it at that. And of course, my name is James Coburn. You can find my other work at draftcoburn.wordpress.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Geometrics. And if you like this content and you want more content like this, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Share this video as well with anybody that you know, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Peace.